Schlesisches Tor. Ausstieg rechts.
Der deutsche Spargelkult müsse enden.
Germany's beleaguered defense minister has temporarily dropped his PhD title.
Volkswagen ist eine Perle der deutschen Industrie und ich glaube, das kann man
Ich weiß, wie viel Liebe dahinter steckt. Wenn Glühweinstände aufgebaut werden, wenn Waffen...
Spargel-Weltmeister ist China, denn die bauen 60 Mal mehr.
Hi, it's Michelle.
Hey, this is Ted.
And it's Isaac.
And welcome back to Spaßbremse. We've got a very special guest on the podcast today. It's Matt Christman of Chapo Trap House. Thanks for coming on, Matt.
Thank you for having me.
So far on the podcast, we've really focused on Germany itself, obviously, given the theme, looking at history, culture, politics, and so on. But today we wanted to go beyond, the immediate country of Germany and looking at the people that left it often quite a while ago. There's obviously large German diasporas in a number of countries, most infamously probably Argentina and other South American countries. But we're going to look at the biggest and, strangely, given its size, probably the most invisible one. And that's right, we are talking about German Americans, specifically the United States of America. Sorry to the Canadian on the podcast.
I might try
Isaac.
and insert my own little German Canadian.
Right. We're going to focus on the big
knowledge.
one in the USA. So if you want to chime in about Canada, you can go for it. So yeah, the largest ethnic group in America, according to the census, between 40 and 50 million people. So well over 15%. But strangely invisible as a group, and we'll get into the reason why that is. There's no Sopranos of German Americans or like the St. Patrick's Day parades to the extent that those are, there's isolated German stuff, but nothing is widespread, which is interesting given that it's a far larger group than either Italian American or Irish Americans. And yet it just has a fraction of the cohesive identity. So we want to get into why. First though, striving for accountability on this podcast, let's do a Germanness acknowledgement. Any German roots, ties with German cultural institutions.
I'm ashamed.
Anything
I'm
else?
ashamed
I would venture a guess that we all have a little bit to disclose here. So let's get that out of the way. Matt, do you want to lead us off?
Yeah, so my last name is Christman, which is a German name. My mother's maiden name is also hilariously German. I come from coastal Wisconsin, which is just north of Milwaukee, basically, which is the top point of the German triangle of Midwestern cities that constitutes Milwaukee, Cincinnati, and St. Louis. So I grew up with German Catholics mostly, because this is largely an area that was settled by people from southwestern Germany in the 19th century. So a lot of Friday fish fries, a lot of beer alcoholism, which is like the worst kind you can have, but which is an August German-American tradition. Schnapps in the freezer, that kind of thing. Bratwurst.
Hell yeah. Yeah, Wisconsin being the number one drinking state in America by quite a margin, I believe.
Oh,
yeah. Did go to undergrad there, so experienced a bit of that. Michelle.
well, yeah.
Disclose?
I guess I'll talk about the name thing later, but I did go to school in Pittsburgh, and I worked at one of those restaurants that is basically like a Hofbräuhaus. I had to wear the
Classic.
dirndl, and I hosted there, and so you would get a bunch of people coming in and being like, I'm German.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, okay, cool. Drinking the Steins and all of it. So seeing a bit of it come through the latent German Americanness when they get really proud about.
There's been a resurgence of that a bit. What about your last name?
Oh, okay. So I will. Yeah, my last name is Hainer with a Y, which is obviously an Americanized Heine.
Yeah, Hainer.
Exactly. Yeah,
the
they
Anglicization.
changed it.
Yeah, Anglicization.
At some point.
And so, Matt, I would figure with Christman, it's one N, right?
Yes, it's one N. I think they lost the other N somewhere along the line. But my mother's maiden name has two N's at the end.
Really? Okay. So somebody did that on purpose? Do you think each family went and just
Well,
made their name more.
I mean, my understanding of it is there's, some kind of like the iconic like dropping at Ellis Island sort of thing of like a mistranscribing it or whatever. There's some of that. There's also some of like maybe people just trying to fit in when they're there, but it was especially the World Wars and people trying to hide their German identity. And there were some really like profound shifts in this, like your Müller to Millers and so on were quite famous. So it's tough to know exactly in each individual case why they did it, but it's a really widespread phenomenon of kind of transferring names to a more sort of American sounding thing. Isaac, do you want to go next?
Sure. I mean, I think I maybe have like the most like historically proximate German connection. My Opa moved to Canada in the early 60s. And so, grew up very much in that sort of more recent like German immigrant experience. My mom's family is like very, kind of steeped in that like very like culturally German, a lot of like German Christmas traditions that I had growing up. My dad's side of the family is like kind of representative, I think, of the more like very distant Canadian German sort of migration patterns. I mean, I remember growing up, like there was always talk about like our Prussian ancestors, which I always found like, especially like, I mean, now looking back, like especially alarming. I also don't even know if that's true. Like I mean, I did some research recently, and I think they were from like Schwerin. So like, I mean, I guess that was Prussia, but it's not really like it's not really like when you think of like Prussia. But anyway, yeah. So
you've still got the umlaut in the
name,
right?
I mean, I still have the umlaut. I have the two N's.
Nice.
I've got it all.
You're just German. You're not even German American.
I've got some like buried Germanness, not in the name or anything, but like everybody, just sort of like lurking there on both sides of the family. Like I said, went to college in Wisconsin, which had a lot of Germanness infused in there, which I'd be curious to hear more about from Matt especially. And I mean, the three of us obviously ended up in Germany, which actually is indicative of a recent trend where there was a huge net inflows of Germans to the U.S. For over a century, and now actually since 1990. There's been a net outflow of Americans to Germany, which doesn't exactly speak well for the sort of triumphalist end of history state of the global superpower that people are actually going net the other way. So before we get into a bit of the history here, which I think it's worth doing a kind of overview because it explains why Germans are where they are, I'd be curious, Matt, like your experience as a Wisconsinite, like what do you make of like the status of German American identity currently? Like how strong is it? How does it manifest itself? Or really any thoughts there?
Well, as you said, German Americans don't have the tradition of sort of ritually reifying their identities the way that other ethnic whites do, and a lot of that has to do with the world wars and everything. A little awkward. So what ends up happening is that, it gets in the Midwest anyway, where German influence is most strongly felt. It just becomes this like background radiation of cultural norms that are really just slight variations on the general American emphasis on consumption as identity. Only in the case of Germans, it's maybe a bratwurst instead of a hamburger. But it's basically still stuffing a dead cow in your mouth.
Yeah, I think that sums it up pretty well. I mean, it's always alluded to in like a weird way, right? Like someone, when they want to justify, they're like, well, we're German, so we have a really strong like work ethic or whatever. And it's like, I hear that a lot. Like I know some families that like dig up, like they're like, this is our German family crest. And it's like, you probably just overpaid some guy who's like ripping you off that makes this thing that, inevitably looks kind of fascist that they'll like have hanging in their house. Like those are the real oddballs that emphasize that. I know a few people like that from back home.
Yeah, I think anybody who's really trying to grasp at German identity is they're looking for something, and they probably look very enviously at all those St. Patrick's Day marchers and stuff. But I think that does just show a hollowness that they can't confront otherwise, because part of what makes the German American identity is so interesting is how much it committed in the 20th century to full assimilation, very quickly too. I mean, there were German language newspapers all throughout the Midwest that just disappeared almost overnight in the early 20th century. And, to kind of go against that means like there's something that isn't sitting well some other way, that you're searching, as we all are. And I think, honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if it becomes more, if trying to resurrect like a German identity doesn't become more of a fixation as people feel, continually more uncertain and dissatisfied with their lives as they know them.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely know some kids from Pittsburgh who seemed very unmoored, and then they start talking about that their strong jawline is like of a German, indicative of like a German past, and that's when you're really struggling.
That's not encouraging. Like it just, I mean, I think really emphasizing like niche or like any kind of like European heritage really hard as like an American is a bit bizarre, and like obviously given German history that has to be infused with like a bit more of a right-wing thing. I think generally, like my basic rule of thumb is like you're just 100% American if none of your grandparents could speak a foreign language. Like,
yeah,
like
no, absolutely. Like that's why for me, like it's fun to think about, and especially just looking at the contours of settlement in this country, and like recognizing the echoes of historical patterns of migration and ethnicity and all that. But like as a part of your identity, it's like, come on. If everybody, you and your family speaks English, you're an American. Yeah, and that sucks. Absolutely. People don't want that to be true, because what is American but, eats burger? And the people want more. Even though they want to eat burger, that's not like that. You try to take their burgers, they will fucking end you. But they want to be more than burger, and so they
bratwurst is so elevated.
But they're not
something else that doesn't exist.
They're not willing to go full like Schweinhaxe or like like the real hardcore German food. Like they'll eat the bratwurst, but like the really gnarly shit.
Yeah.
Like they won't even touch that. So like you said, it's like they want a little flavor of the identity, but not, like they don't want to really commit. No one's gonna actually learn German anymore.
Oh, good God, no! The most hardcore thing that I remember from my childhood is eating cannibal sandwiches, which I'm assuming has some sort of echo in German culinary tradition. Do you guys know what those are?
No, I'm terrified.
Okay. Find out. It's raw ground beef on rye bread with pepper and raw onion.
Oh, okay. So like
a steak tartare on bread,
no,
basically,
like
but ground beef, which you're generally not
nasty.
supposed to eat raw.
Absolutely.
I think it was more popular when people would like go to a butcher as opposed to a grocery store, so they had more confidence in what they were getting.
Well, I remember like visiting Germany when I was 10 and going to visit the farm relatives, and we ate exactly that.
The farm relatives?
Yeah. The farm relatives who had like lost fingers from getting them stuck in threshers, and yeah.
That's wild. I mean, and yeah, when we talk about like the assimilation of German Americans, it's not to downplay like the sort of bizarre pockets that there are still left of like German language and German culture. And so what we mean by like the overall assimilation is assimilation relative to how many people it is. And so
it's wild.
Yeah.
By far the largest percentage of white ancestry in America. And I think the part of what made it kind of fade relative to other ethnicities is, as we said, the world wars. But I think another big part of it is the chronology of immigration to the United States. There were, of course, Germans in America even during the colonies. Benjamin Franklin famously complained all the time about all the krauts he was surrounded with, and how they were gonna like de-Anglify America, and how swarthy they were. But the real big bursts begin at like in the middle of the 19th century, around the time of the 48 Revolution and the associated agricultural distress that left a lot of former farmers and such without access to sustenance and sort of forced across the ocean. But a broad swath of the population, people from all sort of classes, and people who had come from generations of established yeoman peasants came to America, and in that moment when land was really easy and cheap for the taking for European immigrants, largely upon getting to the East Coast, moved inland and got that land. Some of them stayed. There's a neighborhood in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, the Upper East Side of Manhattan, called Yorkville, which until the mid 20th century was known as a German neighborhood. It was a hive of Bund activity during World War II, actually. But for the most part, you had this huge move inland to claim some of that land, and so very quickly the social bonds that had held a lot of these people to their German identity started being just dissolved by the fact that they were, recreating themselves as American farmers. Then they settled in cities where they did settle were in the Midwest, like I said, like Cincinnati, Milwaukee, St. Louis. And there they created the kind of robust ethnic identity that we identify with the other ethnicities. But in the East Coast, which is, that's the headquarters of America culturally and economically, they ended up not sticking around for the most part. The people who stuck around were first the Irish, who were showing up around the same time, but in a vastly more destitute position, unable for the most part to access the capital that would have let them go inland and become farmers. So they stayed sort of huddled in those East Coast cities, and the Irish ethnicities that we think of now are largely like a political response to that situation of finding a way to organize themselves and to gain some sort of access to economic stability in the absence of any access to capital, which ended up just being like their sheer numbers and ability to move votes in elections. And that gave them the ability to gain access to rungs of political power and then gain access to the burgeoning civil services that had to emerge to deal with these, rising cities. So Irish identity in America is like a politicized, really, attempt to assert economic power in the American, East Coast metropolis. And Germans were doing that in the Midwest too, but, farther from the eye of culture. Sort of, it wasn't a flyover then yet, obviously, but it was like the train through, I guess. And then, so like in the rural areas where you had a vast amount of German immigration, the process of Americanification was happening almost immediately. And then the world wars did the job of sort of breaking up those pockets of German identity in the cities that did still exist.
Absolutely, yeah, and as Matt, you alluded to a lot of the history, and we'll get into a little more detail about that because I think it's quite interesting. And also, you mentioned the geography, of course, and it's really, really concentrated. I mean, they say there's sort of a German belt, that stretches, about from the sort of Pennsylvania across to Oregon, but it's not as strong in the West, right? Like it's really, really concentrated around the Great Lakes, sort of. If you're on the western shore of Lake Michigan in Wisconsin, all the way down through Chicago, a little farther south, St. Louis, and then stretching through Pennsylvania. I mean, you can see it on these maps. We'll try to link to one. Yeah. It really shows this like sort of bright red of the concentration of the Germans along that like kind of broad L shape.
Yeah, the pop belt.
Yeah, exactly.
Although weirdly enough, where I'm from, right on the coast of Lake Michigan, we say soda, but like literally one county inward, it's pop, and it's pop all the way to the west coast practically.
Oh, that's funny. I didn't make that connection.
On that.
Are you soda in Boston?
Yeah, we're soda.
Okay, we're soda in Washington. What are you in Canada?
I think we say pop.
Okay,
yeah.
Interesting. The pop belt goes across the border
to Canada. Yeah.
And so I mean, I think another thing that you mentioned or alluded to, Matt, is the sort of lack of like a cohesive identity of the German Americans. And I think that also has to do with, like you said, the political situation at the time, because obviously you have the failed 1848 revolution, you have, and then shortly thereafter, like the Homestead Act in America. So you're having political upheaval in Europe at the same time as they're opening up a bunch of land in the United States. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, it's also worth pointing out in terms of the lack of a cohesive identity is it's not like there was a single sort of unifying religion in Germany in the same way there was in other countries where there was strong immigration to the U.S. Obviously, there were a lot of both Protestants and Catholics immigrating in large numbers. And of course, Germany itself was not even a country until 1871. So people might have had a German ethnic identity, but they might have associated more with their specific region, their specific religion, and not seen themselves as really a member of a German nation at the time they moved to the U.S. So it makes sense that the bonds were slightly more on a cultural and linguistic front than they were like a national front per se.
I mean, the closest thing to like a unifying political current that unified, that brought together certainly the urban Germans of that era was socialism.
Yeah.
And that was simply undigestible by the United States. Like the Irish political project, as I said, was a pragmatic effort to access, political and economic power in conditions of deprivation, plus resentment of English imperialism, which were, to one degree or another, not challenging any of the real prerogatives of the American state project. Whereas the implicit socialism of a lot of the German culture, which of that time, which led the urban Germans to be vehement opponents of the Confederacy during the Civil War.
Yeah, they fought in huge numbers in the war against the South. Yeah,
Missouri was prevented from seceding formally from the Union essentially by a bunch of German militiamen in St. Louis who were able to rally together to prevent the capital from being claimed by slave power sympathizers in the state. And German immigrants were lynched in East Texas by secessionists for their unionist views. And then after the war, they were at the forefront of labor organizing. Many of the Haymarket martyrs of the first May Day, the bombing in Chicago, were German, and that radicalism was not. It was going against the current of the American, project at that time, and so it had to struggle in a way that the more quiescent political currents in other, white ethnics at the time weren't.
Yeah, and it's exactly. I mean, I know in Milwaukee in particular, like it was pretty much exclusively Germans that were involved in a really, really powerful socialist movement there, and it's hard to see the backlash against German Americans, which we'll get into in a little more detail, the backlash, especially during the World Wars and the First World War in particular, it's hard to see that without a bit of the context of the radical political views, right? It seems like a bit of two birds with one stone. Like, say they're loyal to the Kaiser, but it's actually you want to like get rid of some socialist agitation.
I mean, because the anti-war sentiment of German Americans during World War I at first was very strong, as it was for like the broad sector of the American population. Like most Americans didn't want to fight in World War I. Woodrow Wilson famously campaigned for re-election in 1916 on the slogan "He kept us out of war" before going "Oops, psych." And then the first modern propaganda machinery was put to work getting Americans on board, and for a number of reasons. Cultural and ethnic affinity being one, but socialism being another. Germans resisted, and they were repressed in that. There were actually lynchings of Germans who showed insufficient deference to the war effort, and it led, and famously, sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage.
That's a joke, right?
No, literally not a joke at all.
Yeah. They started changing street names. I know in Cincinnati they started changing a lot of the street names.
Yeah.
There's a suburb of Milwaukee that is currently, and I always grew up hearing it pronounced New Berlin. I don't know if you've ever heard of New Berlin, Wisconsin.
Berlin. Yeah, they would say it really funny. I remember meeting people from there. Yeah.
Yeah, New Berlin, which that was obviously used to be New Berlin until people thought that was a little too disloyal. So they decided to, instead of going through the trouble of changing all the stationery and the signs and the maps, they just decided to change the way they pronounce it.
I think in Michigan they might have renamed the Berlin there to like Basel or Bern or something to try to like conjure a different image. And yeah, I mean, at this point, you already have kind of a backlash, right, against what like Teddy Roosevelt called hyphenated Americans. That you can only have full Americans. During the war, the Justice Department, they prepared a list of German aliens, counting almost 500,000, and 4,000 were imprisoned. I mean, we associate like internment camps and imprisonment obviously with the Japanese Americans in World War II, which was on a much higher scale. But this is really nothing to scoff at. And the thousands. Some of this is just from the Wikipedia here, which is actually quite extensive on the topic. They say thousands were forced to buy war bonds to show their loyalty during the First World War.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's Isaac. Did you want to jump in?
I was just gonna jump in with the whole renaming thing to say that there's like quite a large city in southern Ontario called Kitchener that used to be called Berlin. For like quite a while, it was known as Berlin, and then it was renamed around that time to Kitchener, and it still has like a huge German population, of course. But
yeah, that's interesting. I guess there were a few hung on, right? You still got your Bismarck in North Dakota. Like there's a weird mix of like very German sounding ones, and then these like awkwardly renamed towns. And like you said, this is kind of the like key hinge point in like when the assimilation really begins. Obviously, World War II is important as well, but like the World War I is the critical thing. Right? There were Matt, you kind of alluded to this. There were 800 German language publications in the United States at the end of the 19th century. Omaha, Nebraska had 57% Germans in 1910. Like just really some very, very concentrated pockets, and of course especially just in that broad swath of territory that we were talking about, Germans all over the place, really. Yeah, so you have in a way some things that feel a bit reminiscent of how people are treating Russian culture today, things that we look back on. I remember in like U.S. history class in high school going through some of the things like you said, Liberty Cabbage, you're like, that's so ridiculous. Can you believe like who would do that? It must have been only those barbaric idiots 100 years ago. They started not playing Wagner in German in the symphonies. They started renaming, like you said, renaming street names. They started, renaming foods.
And now we have like a Kiev mule instead of a Moscow mule.
Removing German books from the library in St. Louis, for example. And so really odd parallels to this kind of hysteria we're getting now with Russia, sort of showing that this idea that we learn from history or things kind of get better over time maybe isn't the case.
Yeah, no, just a cycle of idiots on a wheel of dumbassedness.
Exactly. Yeah, and we're not even fighting in this one this time, and we're still getting that into it. So
we just love it. We're like, oh, we got to get in on this. It's so much fun.
And it's like, no, but it was bad then because it was nationalistic, and now we're supporting freedom. And it's like,
exactly.
Don't you think that's what they said back then too? like, do you think they were just like, we're being xenophobic, everybody? Let's be xenophobic. It's like, no, like obviously they're using the same like liberal justifications that we hear now, and like Woodrow Wilson being the president at the time, I think is quite interesting in the way that he has kind of parallels to the Obama-esque leadership of later on of even like you said, Matt, campaigning against the war, and then oopsie, let's do a bit more war a few years later. And yeah, overall, like thousands arrested, and just renaming, discouraging the teaching of the German language in a lot of regions of the U.S., which is really, really strong. These pockets where only German was spoken. Wisconsin, famously, and I believe this is something I remember from a class in college, actually. We did like a Wisconsin history. They said they called Wisconsin the traitor state in 1917 when war broke out. And then to demonstrate their patriotism, they volunteered and bought war bonds in the highest percentage of any state in the Union. So
yep. They're just sweating. Like, is this okay? Is this okay? Please.
Yeah, please. I'm American. Come on. Just getting down on the knees. And like I said, this is really that like crucial point in time where you really get that full swing from like a strong identity in whole areas where there was only German spoken. I mean, there was, I believe in Wisconsin right before the war, there was 25% of the state spoke only German and no English. Like just really, really crazy.
Yeah.
So then you get Schmidt to Smith, Muller to Miller, et cetera. Which is why you have like relatively few like German sounding names, despite how common they should be. And in the interwar period, right, you have a bit of a softening of the attitudes, kind of like a German culture is allowed to spring up a bit more. You obviously have the like you mentioned, it's like some just full on Nazis with the Bund. And that's
Wait, what was that about? Can somebody
Matt, do you want to explain? I think you
yeah.
know
So
about that.
in the lead up to World War II, there was again a very strong current of anti-interventionism that was bipartisan and all throughout the country. People, they were annoyed and pissed off that they had gone into World War I, and they're like, we're not going to do that again. And there was, among German Americans, a very strong resistance to entering the war, once again, due to all those ethnic connections. But the most vehement opponents of entering the war were Germans who were not just, against foreign entanglements, but who were actively supporting the Nazi state and its project in America. And they formed an organization called the German American Bund, which had rallies against entering the war. They would do street violence against Jews. They had a famous rally in Madison Square Garden.
Oh, right.
Yeah, the pictures
I've
of that
seen-
are pretty famous. Yeah.
And Meyer Lansky, the Jewish gangster from New York, spent a lot of the 30s beating them up at their rallies, apparently. Him and the other guys would throw stink bombs into the meetings and then punch dudes who came out with brass knuckles.
Yeah, sort of a little street fighting, paralleling, I guess, a bit what was happening in Germany at the time, but somehow swept under the rug historically a bit more than you get from portrayals of
interestingly,
Weimar.
the Bund was largely a East Coast phenomenon, as I said. Like, they had the big rally in Washington in Madison Square Garden, and they were very active in Yorkville, and they actually created some Nazi summer camps on Long Island.
No way.
And there are small
Once and forever cursed.
private towns there's a town in Long Island, I think, that to this day has like streets named Himmler and stuff. I don't know. I think that they recently were forced to get rid of their restrictive housing covenants, but yeah, they held out for a long time. But relatively little of that stuff in the Midwest, like in the German heartland, probably because of their harsher experience of having their more coherent German identity being squashed earlier.
And also maybe the class
the fact
basis.
that a lot of their political energy had been directed into like a socialist project that wasn't dead by that point. Milwaukee famously, as Alice Cooper said, had 3 socialist mayors, including a mayor who governed Milwaukee all through the 50s, the height of the Red Scare, named Frank Zeidler, who was a member of the Socialist Party.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's obviously important to sort of distinguish, right? Like Germans not being a monolith, as we mentioned before. The different class elements, different waves, and I think that obviously plays into the political views as well. I mean, sort of more not as wealthy of people, kind of moving, like you said, to the more inland Midwestern areas, and maybe not sharing these exact political views of the sort of broader kind of social base of fascism, of this petty bourgeois groups. And of course the war does break out, Germany declaring war on the U.S. day after Pearl Harbor. And like I said, not as famous as the repression against Japanese Americans, not as infamous, I should say, but still interning about 11,000 German citizens between 1940 and 1948. So it was going after the actual people with German citizenship, not the which is still ridiculous, but not the extremely barbaric thing that was done to Japanese Americans, where they just had been there for generations and just were full American citizens and didn't speak Japanese and had a U.S. passport. But some echoes of that, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, the German effort to assimilate between the wars clearly worked. You have much less repression of Americans with German heritage. And you actually had a guy with the name Eisenhower in charge of the entire war effort.
Yeah, Chester Nimitz, so on. Like a lot of very high-ranking people involved in the war. And you actually get these pretty heroic portrayals, right, of German Americans in kind of popular media, right? There's always a Band of Brothers, or I think in Saving Private Ryan, you always got the one German-speaking guy that sort of like helps out the company as they're marching through France and Germany in World War II, and it's sort of like. It seems to really like symbolize this idea of immigration, and like they became the good immigrants and the people that then fought, the homeland for freedom or whatever. And it really, I think, has become a kind of American mythology about like the good immigrant that learns the language and assimilates and so on. And I've heard some of my like grandpas. I used to go out to sometimes with breakfast with them when I'd visit him, and they got all the old guys out eating breakfast. A lot of them are old Germans. Talk about the old country and whatever, even though they don't speak a lick of German. And they'd say things like, "Well, it's different today. With Spanish, like none of them are learning English. They're staying in these pockets in these communities and refusing to learn it." And it's like, just like we said, there were hundreds of German language newspapers, hundreds of thousands of people that didn't speak a lick of English, like before the war. And so it's like. It's not like all white people assimilated as fast as you think, man. Like it's funny though how it's framed politically in the present day.
Yeah, I mean everybody wants to imagine that they did it differently, that their families did it differently, and honestly, they did, because they came at a time when there was no such thing as illegal immigration. Yeah, that is the funniest thing when people say my ancestors did it the right way. If you showed up, you were an American. Yeah. It required you didn't have to do anything.
I'm not against immigration. I just think
as long as you weren't an anarchist and had tuberculosis, they let you in.
Oh my God!
Even a few anarchists got in with the Haymarket
affair.
Yeah,
well, you just got to lie. That's the beauty.
Yeah.
They just asked you. It's like, hey, don't tell them. How about that?
Yeah, exactly. It's I guess it's a good screening mechanism for getting relatively smart people who aren't.
Yeah, they used to say, "Anarchist says what?"
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think that kind of takes us through most of the history, and now I think it's probably makes sense to like reflect a bit on the current state of it. And then after the war, right? You have a sort of a broad like reconstruction and resurgence, I think, of the acceptance. I should say acceptability of German Americanness as Germany becomes, a NATO ally against communism, and sort of you get the Wehrmacht actually kind of being rehabilitated with this like clean Wehrmacht myth and so on. And I think the status of German Americans then kind of goes up. Obviously, you have some quite famous German immigrants to the U.S. with Werner von Braun and a few other characters.
All those Project Paperclip guys.
Exactly. Yeah. Getting the old Nazis to help us with our technological skills to
apparently
fight the Soviets.
In the 50s and 60s, there were a disproportionate number of German restaurants in Huntsville, Alabama, which is where the NASA rocket program was headquartered. Because of all the von Braun associates who had been brought over to work on the program, they wanted somewhere that they could get some pig knuckle.
Good stuff, yeah, and pretty prominent in a number of academic disciplines. Obviously, you have some pretty well known German academics that helped really found a lot of like the modern international relations discipline. You have like Hannah Arendt, of course. I mean, Einstein came over. Like the list goes on. I mean, if you click like important German Americans, it's like you'd spend forever reading it. Like there's so many. You got like kind of modern influence. Modern gymnastics came. So thanks Germany for that. What is it? Friedrich Ludwig Jahn, like the founder of gymnastics, kind of a proto-fascist himself. Gymnastics itself has pretty sketchy origins. As like let's all build fitness and strength.
This podcast is anti-gymnastics.
Like, it's not really what you associate as like right-wing politics now, but it has roots in that. German speakers in the U.S. Almost 3 million in 1910, going down to about 1 million today, but still like. That's a lot of people,
I would hear them in Pittsburgh. Like you're just like walking down the street and you hear a German speaker, but it's clearly not like either a native speaker who grew up in Germany and learned it there, and it's also not an American speaking German. It's like this weird blend of this kind of accent. I mean, you can like go look at like the Pennsylvania Dutch kind of blend that
There's
exists.
Wisconsinite German too.
Yeah.
That's its own dialect. Like there's a whole bunch of different weird dialects that mix a bunch of like different elements of German, English, and other languages. I mean,
They're out there.
my parents, they met in Cincinnati, and they said everyone when they would hand you something like a beer or a plate of food or something, they would say please. And they were like, well, what's with that? And then when I came over here and learned German, I was like, oh, Mom, that's because you say bitte when you give someone something in
That's so
German. It's a
funny.
translation of that. And so they still say it there. Yeah.
Weird hangover.
Yeah, very, very bizarre. So it's like there's these faint traces, right? Like we said, but yeah, no complaining about anti-Italian discrimination or anything like that. It's the
Well, I mean,
Sopranos.
the Italians were the last ones into the boat of whiteness at the turn of the century, so they've got that chip on their shoulder about it to this day.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, yeah, like I said, thinking a bit, maybe reflecting a bit about the weird ways in which that culture manifests itself. And, I'll quote here from a couple secondary sources. This guy, Melvin Hawley, writes, as we kind of mentioned, public expression of German ethnicity is nowhere proportionate to the number of German Americans in the nation's population. Almost nowhere are German Americans as a group as visible as many smaller groups. Just to show that this is academics saying this kind of stuff, not just us like riffing about this. It's really really quite true. And I mean, in a way, like you think about basically our last two presidents, Donald Trump claiming to be Swedish forever when he's actually German, and Joe Biden, I believe, having German roots, right? But always going on about how Irish he is.
Well, that's the thing is like if you have a little bit of if you have like one grandparent who is Irish and everybody else is German, you're probably, especially if you want to be a glad-handing ward healer in the East Coast in the late 20th century, you're definitely going to emphasize the Irish over the German.
Absolutely. And
I have a question that maybe it doesn't pertain right now to specifically what we're talking about, but maybe going back to sort of the German immigration and settlement. Was there a region of Germany where immigration mostly happened from? Was it mostly from the south? Was it from the west? Was there a specific area?
You had different waves from different areas. I don't know that much about this, but I think that the first big wave that hit the Midwest was from southern Germany, which is why it's so much Catholic Germans. The German Triangle I'm talking about, those Germans were predominantly Catholic. The cities of Cincinnati, Milwaukee, and St. Louis still have this German Catholic identity that's still part of their greater framework. The biggest Oktoberfest outside of Germany is in Cincinnati every year, called Cincinnati, they call it. And in fact, the fillet of fish was invented in Cincinnati by a McDonald's franchisee who saw every Friday that he was getting annihilated. Nobody was coming in to eat any burgers. So he thought, how am I going to get these frickin' these Catholics to come in here and eat? And he said, what if I fry some fish up? And then corporate took it up and nationalized it.
Wow.
But so you had the big first mid-century wave is from southern Germany, the German Catholic areas that were at that point dominated by Prussia politically, dominated by Lutheran Prussia politically, and were chafing under that resentment. And then Prussian immigrants, I think, came later in the century. But so I grew up around, and my background is German Catholic for that reason.
yeah, and there were also specific little pockets. For example, you have people from Rhineland-Pfalz coming into parts of the Northeast really quite early on before American independence.
Yeah,
you have some people
those
from
people Franklin was pissed off about.
Yeah, exactly. You have people from Swabia who actually were some of the few Germans that ended up in the South. So I guess they liked staying in the South, So, but yeah, like you said, Matt, it comes in all these different waves. It's quite complex exactly who moves where, and now it's but obviously the Lutheran
the
Lutheran
Lutherans,
Catholic debate being divide being big.
You can start to see it in the the geography, because Wisconsin, the coastal area is predominantly Catholic, and then as soon as you get a couple counties in, it becomes predominantly Lutheran, because you had. But then that's also when the Scandinavians started showing up. So
yeah, especially as you get to Minnesota, right? It starts getting real
exactly,
Scandi. Yeah.
But I'm sure
Yeah.
plenty of those Lutherans were also, Prussians also as well.
I guess the Bavarians were used to all the lakes there, so they wanted to be close to Lake Michigan, and the sort of more inland Protestants were a little more happy with a similar area.
Yeah,
of
it's
Wisconsin.
like, can I just get a big sandy plain, please?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like that sort of belt that we talked about, right? It really parallels like the parts of America that have a climate kind of like Germany is basically what it
exactly.
is.
Although I was really surprised, like I was just in Texas, and I was like super surprised by how many German American communities there were in Texas, especially like San Antonio. I was super surprised. I was just in San Antonio, Texas, and I was so surprised by how many German Americans I encountered there, and how many like German American towns there were around there. Like I went to a place
the
called
hill country,
Green.
the hill country between Austin and San Antonio was a huge migration spot for Germans. There's a bunch of German towns still there where the German is spoken. LBJ during his presidency took, I think, Willy Brandt or Konrad Adenauer, one of those guys, to the Texas Hill Country to show them, all the beer halls and the bratwurst and stuff. So that's probably the most concentrated area of German settlement in the South, is that hill country area of like central West Texas.
Yeah, I was in this place called Green, which is actually spelled like Grüne, like Gruene, and went to this like very German like beer hall where you could buy like Spaten, and you could buy like this beer called Shiner Bock, which like is made in Texas, but like tastes exactly like a German beer. It's like very peculiar. I was not expecting that in South Texas.
They also had a water slide chain that was started in Texas called Schlitterbahn.
Yeah, yes, I saw that too.
That's great.
Yeah.
Have you guys ever heard of Helen, Georgia?
No.
So we were on Chapo guys. We were on tour last month, and we drove from Charlotte to Atlanta, and we drove through to the North Georgia, the old, which had been it had been the site of the first gold rush in American history in the 1820s, and then was a logging economy for years after that. And there's this town there called Helen, and in the 60s, the sawmill closed down, and the economic engine of the town was winding down, and they were all worried, what are we going to do to keep people here, to keep it vibrant? And the town decided, because there was a German artist who lived in the town, they said, hey, what if we just let him go hog wild and turn the town into like a Bavarian village? And so this little town nestled in the woods in North Georgia the entire downtown area is all in like that classic, German half timber style. And they've got German bars, they got the beer halls, and they just said, hey, that'll be our deal. We'll be the place to go if you want to just like spend a day in Germany. And apparently it was a big success, because we were there, in a spring day. It was kind of rainy, and it was packed. People were going to town, because at the end of the day, that German public culture, the beer hall stuff, the stuff that made them so resistant to prohibition, and so hard to integrate into the post-war Republican political coalition that was all about, Protestant propriety, really is pretty fun. It's like we sat down, and I had the big bratwurst, and I had the beer, and I just said to everybody, I was like, how can you stay mad at these people? Come on.
Well, we sure didn't. We sure didn't. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, no, it's funny you say that, because when we were talking about the sort of a pretty mixed bag politically of the group, obviously a bit of a very strong anti-slavery sentiment, a bit of fascism later, a lot of socialism. So like it's tough to like generalize about like what political influence they've had overall in the country, but very strong anti-prohibition force in the U.S. So,
and they tried to keep alive in America for a long time, a public like communal culture. Like they created these things called the Turner Societies, which were these
I wanted to mention that.
These like socialist infused and inspired communal halls where they would come together to try to, like, you know, maintain a sense of community life. And they also, of course, had the beer halls to do that. And, you know, the entire time they were doing that, it was against the tide of sort of American atomization. And, you know, they held out for a long time. But I think, yeah, the political pressure caused by, you know, the resistance to socialism, by the world wars, and the fact that, like, Germanness did not have a political, economic valence the way that other ethnicities did, meant that even with all of that real, you know, energy to maintain a social world, the 20th century was just gonna wipe it all away.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's funny you mentioned this town in Georgia, Matt, because there's a very, very parallel town in my home state of Washington, Leavenworth, Washington.
Yes, I've driven through Leavenworth.
Yeah. And I wonder which came first, and probably, it seems like one must have copied the other, because it's also a declined logging town. And the way I read the history of it, it was like the 1960s, and they realized the industry's drying up. Yeah, the industry's drying up. They don't have much going on anymore. And they actually looked to Solvang, California as an example, weird Danish town, which is weird because it doesn't look like Denmark at all there. But they made Leavenworth look like a Bavarian town, which kind of makes sense. It's on the east side of the Cascade Mountains in Washington. There's like so
they have the backdrop.
So as a backdrop of these beautiful mountain peaks, there's like pine trees. It kind of looks like a Bavarian like mountain town, even it has the river flowing, which almost has that kind of bluish color that your alpine rivers have, that like blue-green color. So it kind of checks out in terms of the actual scenery. And they went complete thematic. Like there's this little core town, even the like rich people houses outside of it along the river, you know, where people like to go skiing or do other outdoor activities. And like Seattleites will own homes there. It's kind of a nice place to be, even though it's a bit tacky. But they're like the same exact theme. And it's funny, like there's all these bars, like you mentioned in the other town. They actually get the like Oktoberfest special kegs shipped in because, like, you know, every beer tent in Munich during Oktoberfest will have their like own like Festbier, and they'll actually get the like authentic ones like shipped in there. And people like going there, and like one of my theories about it, and it ties into what you were saying, Matt, of like people kind of missing this communal identity. Yeah. But it's one of the only walkable rural towns in the whole state because they build it like an old village, and so you can walk from your hotel to the bar, to the other bar, to the restaurant, and you're in a like contained community. Yes. And it's like America can only build walkable cities if they're building like either literal Disneyland or Disneylands. Yeah.
It has to have a foreign referent, or else it'll just end up sprawling out without that guiding it and shaping it.
I went there a couple of years ago, and I was like, it's sort of like a joke among like people in Washington. Like it's sort of a bit like gauche or anything to like it. You know, people are like, oh, come on, that's so tacky. And I was there, and like I grew up like always thinking that. I was like, this is actually kind of nice. Like almost nowhere in America, especially on the West Coast, can you just like walk from bar to bar. Like it's actually kind of good.
Yeah. You don't have to worry about crashing into anything or having to like call a car. You can just perambulate while hammered.
Exactly.
Walking while drunk. It's legal. It's fine.
Exactly. But I know you know we can start to kind of close things up here. I don't want to take too much of your time, Matt. But I know, Isaac, you wanted to talk about the Mennonites.
I'm sorry.
The Mennonites. No, we have to. Well, no, just give me a second to preface this a little bit. I'll just read a little bit from the Wikipedia here because they sort of highlight the like core regional groups of some kind of bizarre German communities that still exist. To this day, German speakers can be found in the United States along long-established Anabaptist groups. The Old Order Amish and most Old Order Mennonites speak Pennsylvania Dutch or Bernese German or Alsatian. Along with High German, Hochdeutsch, as people say more, though they're generally fluent in English now. The Hutterites speak Hutterite German, and many Russian Mennonites speak Plautdeutsch, a German dialect coming originally from the area around Danzig, now Gdansk, Poland, as we talked about on our last episode about the Oder-Neisse line. 3 Amish dialects, as well as Hutterite German, are still learned by all children of the group, whereas Plattdeutsch speakers tend to spend much more time in English. Another group of German speakers can be found in the Amana colonies in Iowa, and about only 67% of them speak English. So to give you an idea, there's still these communities where there's really a lot of German spoken, or like certain types of German that's still spoken quite a bit. But Isaac, do you want to chime in about the Mennonites a bit?
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about the Mennonites because they're my sort of like pet favorite or pet interest among the German immigrants, German-speaking immigrants in North America. I mean, especially growing up in Winnipeg, like in Manitoba, there's a huge Mennonite population. The Mennonite Church of Canada is actually based in Winnipeg, and it's sort of like almost a running joke in the city that there's like 10 sort of Mennonite names. And if you're bound to, like, you run into people with these names all the time. It's like Friesen, Taves, Dirksen. You know automatically that these people are Mennonites. And so I just wanted to kind of mention that. I have a few little notes about it. And also, this is, the little Canadian section of this episode.
Okay. I guess.
I guess.
We have to say.
Well, and because I mentioned the Berlin, which then became Kitchener in southern Ontario before, and that was actually I think initially founded by Mennonites who had moved from Pennsylvania, and this was sort of the Pennsylvania Dutch, and they were in opposition to the American Revolutionary War, because one of the main tenets of this Mennonite religion is pacifism. So, but I find this Mennonite history and how they arrived in, especially the region of Manitoba, and then other regions in the U.S. Kind of fascinating, because it's not your typical kind of migration pattern that you maybe associate with German Americans or German Canadians. The first Mennonites arrived from Pennsylvania in the late 1700s, but the majority then arrived over the next 150 years, came actually directly from Europe, but most didn't come from Germany. A lot of them actually did come from Russia, especially in Canada. You mentioned this sort of Russian Mennonite group, which initially sort of moved from the sort of Mennonite heartland or whatever of northern Germany to Danzig, this area of East Prussia or whatever. And then in the 1850s, the Russian state invited them to settle and form communities in Russia. And then with the Russian Revolution, and this is the history that I find super fascinating. So their farms and other properties, of course, were expropriated after the Russian Revolution, and they were sort of persecuted because of their pacifism, but also because they were considered to be the sort of upper class of privileged foreigners who were living in the Russian state, and so this led to a wave of immigration to Canada, the U.S., and Paraguay, which is strange. And then with the World War II, a lot of these Russian Mennonites perceived Germans to be their liberators, and collaborated with the Nazis, often by openly helping to persecute their Jewish neighbors. I mean, it helped that they had this sort of common language that they shared with these Nazi quote-unquote liberators.
Proud tradition of various European ethnicities moving to Canada to be fascists, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly, yeah. And so then that also spurred another wave. And it's so funny to me because growing up in Manitoba, there's this perception that Mennonites are these pacifists, that's what we all know, and that they're super kind of politically progressive, especially the urban Mennonites. So this real kind of split, I think, between Mennonites who live in the cities and Mennonites who live in still these very kind of conservative, isolated colonies where they still speak Plattdeutsch. And but in the cities, they're seen as these sort of super progressive people. They're often involved in lots of activist causes. But then I was really interested, or it's interesting to learn that a lot of this history of their immigration is actually steeped in this alliance with Nazis and their persecution, because they were seen as these upper class foreigners, Nazi collaborators. And then a lot of them were also accepted back to Germany during the Nazi period as the Volksdeutsche. I just find this is my sort of, I also two of my ex-boyfriends are Mennonites, so I really always found it fascinating to go and visit their families. One of them lived in a very small Mennonite community, and they were super homophobic, super still a lot of them spoke this sort of low German. It was just a fascinating kind of world, an hour
it's
from
a remnant,
Winnipeg.
right?
Yeah.
It's just the Pennsylvania Dutch, which the funniest thing I find about them is the Amish, they make their own like wooden toys. And I babysat for this German family that visited the US, got one of these like wooden things created by the Amish, and we're like so excited about it. And it's like, that's your own culture that you like supplanted and then brought back, and they were like psyched on this wooden toy. They were like, look at the craftsmanship, like trying to get me to like nerd out about like a wooden. I was like, no.
Well, the Amish are so weird, right? Because they're like, well, this is like the pure culture that we need to preserve, but it's like frozen at a very specific point in time, like I guess like late 1700s, early 1800s or something, where they're like, no, we like all of modernity up until this point, but nothing past that. My dad used to work in a hospital there, and he said, yeah, they would come in and then renounce their sort of traditionalism quite quickly as soon as they needed medical care, which makes sense. But yeah, I think that probably covers most things now. But just a few more thoughts on the influence of the Germans. I mean, it's too bad you're on the West Coast now, Matt. So it's probably a little early to share a beer and say Prost. But
never too early. I would absolutely
where would we be without the Germans for beer in America? Right? Obviously,
it's true.
The oldest
we were a bunch
one.
of cider drinking wasps before they showed up. People don't know that, but like the American alcoholic drink of choice was cider. It was really the
I didn't know
Germans
that.
Who
Actually,
showed up and said, "What are you doing? Get some weed in there."
Yeah. You've got obviously Yuengling out of Pennsylvania, the first brewery in America. A lot of familiar names will be Schlitz, Pabst, Miller, Anheuser-Busch, so on. So yeah, all the big breweries coming from the Germans. And then lately, something I did not know, apparently a lot of German immigrants and German Americans helped shape the microbrew movement in America that swept the U.S., which is funny because the microbrew scene in America is a lot more developed than in Germany. So thank the Germans for your quadruple cruise missile bullshit IPAs. And yeah, anything else, Matt?
I thank them for the resurgence in wheat beer. I really the only you talk about like where do you feel like German, and I'm an American, but I do have just like a visceral preference for like a bready Hefeweiss.
Yeah.
That just feels to me like that's got to be some sort of genetic memory. I don't know.
the epigenetic passed down right through the Well, I mean, I would like to thank the Germans for a great export of a man, being of course Henry Kissinger. So I think
absolutely got to give it up for him.
Yeah, got to give it up for Henry. Michelle, any thoughts?
I think that's it.
You know that somebody said about Richard. I forget who said it, but somebody said about Richard Nixon, who had direct lines on his phone to three people: Kissinger, his chief domestic advisor, John Ehrlichman, and his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman. And they said Nixon talks to three people in a day, and they're all Germans. And
hated Jews in good tradition with some of his predecessors from that country. Yeah, that's the Germans. I think, I don't know, mixed bag. You can't say that much bad stuff about
America.
it.
It's mixed bag at best is what you're looking at basically everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for the water slides, I guess.
I honestly think they've acquitted themselves better than the Irish. That's all I'll say.
And I honestly kind of appreciate just the acceptance of like Americanness, not this like bullshit like, hey, I'm Italian. Like, It's just like, no, you're not. Like, shut up. You couldn't speak, like you couldn't order a fucking pizza in Italy. Like, shut up. You're American.
Commandatore.
Yeah, exactly. It's like at least there's a bit of honesty there. It maybe didn't come from the best origins, but what are you gonna do? That's it.
Yeah.
Alrighty. Well, thanks everyone, and thanks so much to Matt for coming on. Obviously, co-host of the podcast Chapo Trap House, which I would guess most people know. But anything else you're working on that you'd like to plug?
Not yet. It's in the works, but right now just the show.
Okay. Well, that sounds great. But yeah, thanks so much, Matt. I really enjoyed that, and you're bringing your experience and knowledge about this about the old Germans to the pod.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was fun.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks again very much to Matt Christman for joining us, and thank you all for listening. Just a quick reminder to follow us on whichever podcast app you are using to listen, if you are not doing so already. That way you'll be notified as soon as we release new episodes. And also a reminder that we do have a Patreon where we are trying to release a couple bonus episodes each month. We have 10 episodes up there right now for you to listen to, including a series on German companies during World War II, a mailbag episode, a couple foreign policy bonus episodes, and 2 episodes of our new series Spaßbremse Grenzen, where we explore the history of Germany's borders. You can access all that and some more perks for as little as $5 per month. And to those who already support us over on Patreon, thank you very, very much. We truly appreciate it. All right, that's it from us this week. We should have another episode of Spaßbremse Grenzen on Patreon next week, and another episode here on the main feed the following week. Or maybe sooner, who knows. Thanks again for listening. Tschüss.